Hi, I'm an Australian guy living here in Belarus, and I have to say, when I moved to Belarus, I really knew nothing about this place. I just assumed it would be kind of culturally similar to Russia, Ukraine, and a few other surrounding countries. I was quite surprised to find the lack of corruption here. If you look at low and medium levels of society, Belarus pretty much functions like a Western country. I really want to contrast Belarus with Russia and Ukraine in particular. And I do this because the latter two countries are often pulled in with Belarus as if these three countries are very, very similar. And in some ways they are. They do share some mentalities and what have you, but the functioning in day-to-day life here in Belarus is very, very different. As I say, you just don't get this low-level and medium-level corruption here. It just doesn't exist. There's no narrative around it at all. Now, let me tell you some stories of corruption from both Russia and Ukraine. You really won't believe what happens in these countries and how deeply the corruption is embedded. Now, if you are from these countries, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you've been here for long enough, you'll also have a pretty good clue. But if you're not, what I'm about to tell you will really shock you about how deeply embedded culture is in countries like Russia and Ukraine. I'm friends with a guy here who was in Russia about 3 years ago. And he's a foreigner living here in Minsk, and he had 2 rental apartments that he stayed in. The first one he stayed in, he paid a deposit, he was paying his rent, and he stayed there for a while and then decided to move out. So he called the landlord and said, "Hey, I'm moving. Thanks for everything. If you want to come do an inspection, come do an inspection, and I'll get my deposit back." So this happened. The landlord came over, and of course, the landlord came over with a gun tucked under his belt there. And when my friend asked for his deposit back, the Russian dude just lifted up his shirt and saw the gun tucked underneath his belt there, and was like, "Okay, looks like no deposit." And the second place he stayed in, these are both in Moscow, the second place he stayed in was a similar situation. The guy comes over to give back the deposit after living there for some time, comes over with 3 oversized mates, and he tore up the contract and said there is no deposit. Now I contrast this with Belarus. Belarus, twice I've lived in apartments and have not paid a deposit. Right, get your head around that. So the first guy, I found him through Airbnb ages ago, and I said to him, "Hey, I want to stay for a month, but later let's do a deal, right?" So he said, "Cool," and we negotiated a price in US dollars for after the first month. So I lived there for a month through Airbnb. The time expires. We agree to a price, and I start paying US dollars per month directly to him. But he never took a deposit because I've already been there a month. He knows I'm kind of there, and there's no great stress. So he never took a deposit. Like, even in Australia, that's not going to happen, right? And this has happened to me twice in Belarus. The same thing. I've moved into a guy's house after knowing him separately, briefly, and again, no deposit at all, which is not usual for anywhere in the world. Now, while I'm on Russia, let me tell a few more Russian stories, and I'll get stuck into the Ukrainian stories. So a friend of mine back in Australia, she is from, I think, Kazakhstan. Now, as you probably know, there's a lot of Russian ethnics in Central Asian countries, right? Because of the Soviet Union, they had freedom of movement, much like the EU does now. So they moved around and settled a lot in Kazakhstan. So she is half Kazakh and half Russian. So her brother, so she moved to Australia, and I know her in Australia. Her brother moved to Siberia in Russia, and he bought a big property with a big house. And he's feeling pretty good, right? Life's good. 16 years goes by. 16. And one day he hears something in his yard, some noise in his yard. So he goes out to his yard to see what the hell's going on out there. And someone is erecting a fence in the middle of his yard. So he goes up to the guy and says, "Stoldaleish, what are you doing in my yard? Why are you putting a fence in my yard?" He's like, "Oh, the owner told me to put this here." And my friend's brother's like, "What are you talking about? I am the owner, mate." And so he goes to the government department in whatever area it is. It was in Siberia, I'm not sure exactly where, but he goes to the local government department and say, "Look, what's going on here?" And they go through the records, and what happened was a guy who one day just drove past the land, thought that the yard looked really nice. So he goes to his mate who works in the government, gives him some money, and they changed the deeds, right? They created a false transaction where that part was sold to him, right? So now, according to the official deeds, he owns only the house and part of the land, and some other dude owns the land, right? Now, this is in addition to the business mafia, which still runs rampant in Russia. It's really hard to start a business and to keep it without it having taken off you or paying some kind of fleecing tax or whatever. So even doctor stories, I've had a lot of doctor stories of doctors not treating you properly, not giving the right prescription, not caring, da-da-da. Now, this will change a little bit in Peter and Moscow. Obviously, this will change a little bit, but generally speaking, this is kind of what people are facing there. And Ukraine is pretty similar, maybe even worse, actually. So, for example, when I was in Kiev, I met an American guy, and he was living in Ukraine, and he was actually studying medicine there. And he was in his final year, I think sixth and final or fifth and final, I think sixth and final year of medicine there. So he's obviously well acquainted with the system, and he's like, look, I haven't met half of my classmates because they just pay bribes to the professors and never come to class, and they graduate 6 years later with a medical degree, knowing absolutely nothing about medicine. Now, most courses you probably don't need to know half what's in them anyway, but for a medical degree you need to know. Yeah, you need to know how this thing works, right? And he was telling me that there's a lot of fake surgeries there. So the surgeon will say, oh yeah, you've got something here in your stomach, we've got to cut it out. And all they do is cut you, snip, don't do anything, and just sew you back up again and pretend that they've taken something out. Something they probably don't have the skill to do anyway because they never went to class. One of my buddies here, an Australian guy living here in Minsk, he was living in Ukraine for 3 years before coming here, and he had a mate there who lived with two Ukrainian guys, and they lived together for like 2 or 3 years, and they would hang out all the time. They'd go to bars together, go to restaurants together, see movies, play sport. They were hanging out, right? They were good friends, at least in the foreigners guy's eyes anyway. And then when it came to him moving out, they gave him the forms to sign him off the lease. But indeed, they weren't forms to sign him off the lease. They were signs to put him on signing it to put him on the lease on his own. Yeah, and to be responsible for all the bills as well. So when he left, it turns out that he was actually now had sole responsibility for paying for this rent where he didn't live anymore. So these guys just scammed him outright. Another example, during COVID, of course, it's pretty much the only country in the world, as far as I'm aware, I could be wrong, that sells legitimate fake COVID vaccine certificates. And apparently, from friends I know there, this is very common, just to pay your $50 and to get your fake vax certificate. Also, leaving the country, you might need a PCR or rat test or whatever was popular back then. And of course, same deal, just pay your $30 and you just get a negative test. Right? They don't actually test you, they just give you the negative, and then you're free to fly around the world. Even going into the country, crossing from Belarus to Ukraine late last year, a buddy of mine was doing that by bus, and all these guys with machine guns got on at the border, telling everyone that all their stuff, all their paperwork wasn't working and it wasn't correct, it wasn't accurate. And my friend argued because he knew it was, but everyone else, they're trying to extort bribes from, right? And it was so extreme that the tour operators here in Belarus, they were like telling people, don't get your papers in order, there's no need. Yeah, because you're gonna have to spend $30 on the papers, or you just give $20 in a bribe, right? Welcome to Ukraine, effectively. Now, I could literally go on all day talking about corruption stories from Russia and Ukraine and other countries in the region as well, by the way, not just these two countries, but you get the point, right? This is what I was expecting when I came here. I was expecting this kind of stuff. I had my guard up, right? Yeah, I was careful, I was paying attention. And as time went on, I realized, oh no, this is an entirely different culture. People just day to day, right, don't function in this corrupt way at all. If you have spent significant amounts of time in these regions, I'd love to hear your stories below. Share some of your favorite corruption stories, your scam stories, whatever else you want to call them. They're not just confined to Russia and Ukraine. Of course, as most countries in the world will have something like this on some level, you know, and some will be even worse probably as well than these countries. So do feel free to share your corruption stories below. I'd love to read some of them. I kind of enjoy hearing them. I don't know why, but it's very interesting to me coming from a fairly clean country in Australia where there's not a lot of corruption. There's a little bit, but it's more hidden and it's limited to certain areas of the economy, whereas in some of these countries previously mentioned, it's just systemic all the way through. It's just every interaction you have, you'll come up against this kind of situation. And look, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world, I don't know, but certainly growing up in Australia and living mainly in Western countries for long periods of time, for me it's quite incredible to hear some of these anecdotes. So do share them below.